Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Jeremy Heighton. I'm the Executive Director of the North Shore Business Improvement Association. I want to thank you for joining us for the first in our Power Hour series of business and organizational development seminars. As we all know, today marks the start of a period in which the business communities across BC begin the process of planning and executing a reopening. What we're going to see is over the next few weeks, there will be additional information coming from the province and most specifically from WorkSafe BC on how to open, health conditions required to open, and any restrictions that may be present. As an administrative note, please note that all the lines will continue to be muted until the question and answer session closer to the end of this period. I do want to acknowledge that a number of our board members, including our President Bryce Herman's on the call, as well as members of our Economic Development Advisory Task Force and some of our YKA Strong partners will also be joining us. To start off, Bryce, do you have a quick comment that you would like to deliver?
Yeah, I'd like to just take the opportunity, first of all, to thank JP Baker for being our first in our series of Power Hour presenters. So thank you for that, JP. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank you, Jeremy, for the work that you've put into pulling this together along with the team at NSBIA. Great series. I think this is going to be fantastic, and I just welcome everybody, and I think this is going to be a very powerful series. So thank you.
Thanks, Bryce. So with that, let's welcome our first speaker. So JP Baker works as a consultant, facilitator, and writer in the nonprofit sector. He helps 21st century organizations, including nonprofits, universities, and public institutions with governance, culture, strategy. JP's work is informed by a wide variety of professional experiences. He's worked as a teacher, a writer, an editor, a manager, and a website designer. And prior to JP Baker Consulting, he's run two businesses, one brick and mortar in Victoria, BC, and one virtual serving clients from Cyprus to Japan. JP has a passion for learning, creativity, and helping groups and organizations articulate who they are and where they're going. JP is also active in the arts community. He's a founding member of the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts and Poetry Canada. And he sings and plays guitar in a rock band called Van Horn, which we'll have to now listen for. Please help me welcome JP Baker to lead the session.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jeremy. Thanks, Bryce. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is fantastic. I think it's really important to take these opportunities to do some learning together. So I'm just I got a PowerPoint for y'all. So let me just bring this up here. Bear with me for 1 second here. All right, can I get a thumbs up if you can see that? Bryce, I see you in my screen. You got it. Okay, so yeah, we're here today to talk about nonprofit COVID-19 crisis response. And I just want to say to begin with, nonprofit, this is a very diverse sector. Some people will immediately think of community agencies, social services, but I just want to acknowledge how diverse this whole sector is. We have people on today from the arts community. That's very important. We have people on from animal welfare. But there's a lot of nonprofits too that are actually focused on supporting and promoting business, like the North Shore Business Improvement Association. We have Tourism Kamloops on today. So I want to acknowledge them. We also have, I know we had a registrant from a professional association too, and we sort of forget about those when we think about nonprofits as well, but they're massive nonprofits. Here she comes actually right now. So I want to acknowledge that. I'm not sure if we have anyone from sports and recreation on today, but it's important to remember that things like Kamloops Minor Baseball, Kamloops Youth Soccer, these are nonprofit organizations too, doing amazing things for our community. So welcome everybody. And I just wanted to start here by sort of acknowledging that, this has been a learning time for all of us. I'd like to brag about how this is my 20th pandemic. That is not true at all. And I think we've all been learning together here. So I just want to acknowledge some of the learning that I've been doing, or some of the organizations that I've been learning with. Vantage Point is an amazing organization in Vancouver that does a lot of similar work that I do. And we collaborate pretty closely. Lots of other organizations there. And locally, I've had tons of great conversations with all sorts of great people: Danielle Baker, Christy Rintoul, Lisa Fuller, Elise Laird, Margaret Krumka, Arjun Singh, Kathy Sinclair, Nathan Lean, Amy Baskin. And I mentioned these people. They're not the only ones I've been talking to, but I've been talking with them regularly. There's people who aren't on that list, but I just want to emphasize the learning process here. And so my job today is to convey some of what I've been learning to you, in the hopes that it's helpful, in the hopes that you come away from this with a few nuggets that will help your organization. And we'll continue this conversation. It's an ongoing learning exercise. So let me start by taking you back just a couple of months here. This is March 14th. This is where we were, up in this little room at the Exchange. We were there for a planning session, actually. I did a full day strategic planning session there. I think Sean, you're on the call today. We were there with a group. This was early days in COVID, and we were kind of a little bit naive about things. I do remember 2 people had recently returned from overseas, so they had to Zoom in to our meeting. I remember one of the directors I'd never met before walked in, and she held out her hand to shake my hand, and I very awkwardly said, "I'm sorry, we can't do that." This is when that kind of stuff was still not totally worked out. And I remember at the end of that session saying, you know, I think a week from now, we probably won't be able to do this. And it's true. And I haven't been in the Exchange for a meeting since then. I miss it very much. I'm hopeful that at some point in the not too distant future, we'll be able to have some group sessions there. And I wish I were there in person with you all, but here we are virtually. We've had to adapt creatively. That's just the way it is. And it's all good. So let me tell you just a little bit about what happened when this all went down. After March 14th, you know, that's when we really got to know Bonnie Henry. She announced some important protocols. And I got to admit that, you know, as a consultant, I'm a small business owner. I experienced what a lot of other people experience, which was initial panic. I had a good 2 days of looking at my business and thinking, what on earth is happening here? But I got over that after a couple of days. And a few things that I did immediately were, I reached out to a lot of my clients, present and past. I wanted to know what they were going through, experiencing organizationally, and what the leaders were going through. I engaged in a lot of discussions at the provincial level, especially through my partners at Vantage Point, conversations with umbrella organizations, and roundtables on everything from governance to nonprofit crisis management. And I also, with the help of Christy at United Way and Lisa Fuller, we did a survey of local nonprofits, and we had a good response to that survey. That was to help us get a sense of what organizations are dealing with locally, so that we can actually devise some interventions to help them out. And so that survey, and we started convening community roundtables every 2 weeks. That activity led to what we're calling ChangeLink, which is an initiative to promote coordination, connections, and creative conversations in Kamloops and region nonprofit sector. And so we'll be launching a website very soon. We've actually just released version 2 of that survey. We have some early results rolling in. I'm very keen to see what has changed for organizations over the past month. And we've added a few questions there that will help us actually learn what the experiences are different types of organizations. So I mention that because if there's things that come up today that I can't answer, and I'm certainly not an expert on all things nonprofit, I'll make a note of that, and I'd love to find some resources for you and put them on the ChangeLink website to help you out. Great. So rolling along, here's what we're going to do. Our time together. So I'm in the middle of a little introduction here. Then I'm going to walk through 6 steps. So I've sort of outlined 6 steps. We've got reaffirm, respond, review, mobilize, plan, and forge on. And then we'll do some questions and discussion. So, and I won't keep you more than an hour. If you want to stick around and Jeremy lets us, maybe we can have some more conversation, but I don't keep people over time. All right, so a couple of caveats here. These are not discrete steps. So this is not chemistry. This is not a recipe where you must do this and then you do this. So you'll look at your organization and the things that you've done, and you'll see that you've bounced around within the sort of steps that I've outlined here, and that's fine. The other thing that's important to acknowledge is that different organizations have vastly different experiences, okay? There are no cookie cutter solutions or approaches to dealing with a thing like COVID, which we've never dealt with before, but we are learning a little bit more about how different organizations, what they're facing. So we can sort of separate organizations based on, for one thing, who they serve or their mission. So if your organization is dealing with vulnerable populations who are directly impacted by COVID, you're going to have to adopt certain approaches to that. You may be serving actually populations or fulfilling a mission that actually has gone into complete hibernation at this time. And so your approaches might be a little different too. But also primary revenue streams. So we've been seeing that, for example, if you receive a lot of funding through government contracts, that's one thing. Overall, we've seen more stability for organizations there. But if your revenue streams are earned revenue, for example, or event-based fundraising, you have much different impacts. And in many cases, organizations that rely on earned revenue and event-based fundraising are in deeper crisis right now, financially, anyways. But also how they're governed. You know, governance is an evolving concept. Our ideas of governance in the 21st century are different than they were in the 20th century. And there's a lot of people involved in governance beyond just the board. So we'll see a lot of different responses from different boards and how leadership functions. Also, whether they're member-driven. So in my conversations, most member-driven organizations right now are actually reevaluating their value proposition to members. And for some of them, it was maybe a little bit of an overdue experiment, and they've been forced into it. But what we can offer members and for what value and at what price is being completely reevaluated. And finally, where they're located. So there's a big difference between the experiences of rural or small population center nonprofits and large center and city nonprofits. So that's just to acknowledge that there's lots of different things going on here for different organizations, and the steps that you take and the approaches you have may differ. All right, Scale Collaborative, which is a very interesting organization in Victoria that helps nonprofits diversify their revenue streams, laid out these sort of 6 organizational responses to COVID. And you can look at these and you can kind of think of where your organization has settled in here. And it depends on those things that you see on the left side of your screen. So one response is to ramp up to meet critical community need. So organizations that are dealing with vulnerable populations directly impacted have actually increased their service levels. Some are experimenting to meet emerging community needs. There's quite a few in this category, actually. Some are doing what we're calling steady state. So they're holding but doing a different delivery. So this is if you're offering the same programs and services, but you're trying to do so in a virtual environment, for example. And then there's hibernation. Some organizations have, I don't want to say shut right down, but are actually asleep. I'm involved with one of them actually that made a strategic decision to actually hibernate at this time for various reasons. There's also amalgamate, and this hasn't been, I haven't heard this one discussed too much. I do think it needs to be on the table for some organizations. I feel that amalgamation opportunities can be lost easily if they're not discussed far ahead of time. And for some, it's just simply not an option, not on the table at all, and that's fine. And then finally, there's shutdown. And we will see, you know, I'm not a gloomy person, but, you know, we get 15 to 20% of nonprofits who say they are fairly doubtful that they will survive this crisis. So we need to, that's why when I look at the amalgamate piece, I think perhaps some of those 15 to 20% should start thinking amalgamation early if they're feeling really pessimistic about their chances for survival. And amalgamate too, there's another option that we've been discussing, especially for organizations in large urban centers, is co-location. So there's lots of opportunities for organizations to get together and share facilities costs. All right, so that's organizational responses, kind of 6 basic ones. You can probably see where you are, and obviously approaches will differ within those. Let's go on and talk about what I've outlined sort of as step 1, which is the reaffirm. My first question there is, what story do you want to tell about this crisis? And I think this future retrospective sort of questioning is very helpful in determining sort of the decisions we make but also our communication strategies. And so you can complete this sentence for yourself. When the people we serve look back on this time, we want them to say that and you can fill in the blank and say, what is the story that you want your people to tell about this time? You know, it's very easy to go into crisis mode, to be reactive, and to not think down the road. But I think it's important to ask these questions and to create a good story for your organization during this super tough time. Because crises are defining moments for organizations and leaders. These are tests in many ways. It's interesting because many of the organizations I work with, I will ask them, I will say, you will face a crisis within the next 3 years. What do you think it is? And this is a risk management conversation. Of course, when I've asked organizations this in the past 3 years, nobody has said a pandemic. So we are in uncharted territory here. Nobody anticipated this, but it is a defining moment. And people are looking to you as an organizational leader and your organization to deal with uncertainty. There is uncertainty everywhere here. And it's not a matter of not having uncertainty. It's a matter of someone in the organization being able to deal with that confidently, approach it confidently, and then help quell anxiety throughout the organization and the organization's external stakeholders. And that's why we're asking these reaffirm questions. So I think it's very important to sit down, look at your vision, your mission, and your values. These don't change in crisis, but they can ground your decisions and your work. It tests them, as I mentioned. So it's very important to do that. Values as a lens through which you make decisions, and that will help you tell a good story. And the other piece of this is revisiting your strategic plan. I don't mean rewriting your strategic plan, but look at your strategic plan. And while your operational plan may seem irrelevant at this point because we're just dealing with too much uncertainty and factors that nobody predicted, your strategic framework probably is not. So that overarching strategic framework, which identifies your vision, your mission, your strategic priorities, your broad goals. In most cases, not all, that is still relevant, perfectly relevant. And to frame your responses within that is a wise idea. You can add new objectives within your strategic priorities, but it's still a good way to organize your work. When I first started doing strategic planning, I used templates and really had this idea that we had to plan in every quarter what was going to happen over the next 5 years. And what I found was, in many cases, organizations were telling me that after about 18 months, with that very detailed strategic plan, they were actually no longer referring to it. In many cases, either things changed internally or externally so much that some of the assumptions that the plan was built on are no longer relevant. And so in some cases, the plan was no longer relevant. So what I've moved to doing now is helping organizations create a very high-level strategic framework. Within that, they do operational planning on a yearly basis. So I'm not about to say what happens in the third quarter of 2025. I'm not pretending that I can say what we should be doing at that time. That's operational planning. We do that on a yearly basis. So just as an example, even if you have a very detailed strategic plan, you can actually surgically remove the framework behind it. So I'll give you an example of what a framework might look like and show you how it's still relevant. First, this is just something from Vantage Point here that sort of outlines my point here, that there's this very high level vision, mission, success, priorities. That stuff probably hasn't changed. In some cases, I am working with an organization that is considering changing their mission, actually, because they've identified some important new community needs at this time. And so they are having conversations about changing their mission. But in most cases, these things change the same. And down there in the management section there, strategies, activities, and performance objectives, these things will change. So that outlines that. But just as a little example here of a strategic framework that mostly does not change during this time, this is an example from the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts. So you see at the top, there's a vision statement there. That vision is still perfectly relevant. The mission is still perfectly relevant, though this organization does do an annual festival. And so that's a very big question mark. Any organization that does events is facing a lot of question marks at this time and trying to figure out how they either pivot those or adapt those to virtual environments, or how they replace those with other activities that meet the same goals. But if you look at the outcomes there on the right-hand side, those outcomes that this organization is striving for, those are still perfectly relevant. And the question now is, how do we achieve those outcomes in this new environment, in virtual environments, given the uncertainty, given the likelihood that we'll relax social distancing and then have to tighten it, and all of those things. So there's just an example of a strategic framework that doesn't change just because of this crisis. So after you reaffirm, you've got your vision, mission, values, you're going to ground your work in your vision, mission, values, and you've got a strategic plan, then it's time to respond. And so some of the things here you will recognize as things that you have already done, some of the very first steps that you took in your organization. So of course, one of the first things we heard was that people were dealing with HR issues and staffing issues. So you make necessary staffing adjustments. Sometimes that means layoffs, sometimes reductions, sometimes redirecting people's work. This was their job before. During this time, they're going to be working on this and work from home adjustments. And in some cases, organizations are hiring, actually. So that's obviously one of the key parts of responding. Another huge one is technology. So we're trying to ensure suitable technologies in place for staff, clients, members, and board of directors. And don't forget any one of those groups, actually. Sometimes we can be a little bit ad hoc about technology, but I want to just emphasize 4 things in this area that we need to make sure everyone has a suitable grasp of. First of all is hardware. We actually have been talking with organizations that do not have the necessary computers, laptops, devices for either their clients or their staff. So we've actually been trying to connect some organizations with larger institutions which have retired computers or devices. So without the hardware, nobody's doing anything. Then there's the software. There's lots of different tools out there. Zoom obviously has been experiencing a heyday. And I'll have some resources here for Zoom. I don't own stock in Zoom, but they've been doing amazing things. So they need software. It's not the only one. Google has recently upgraded their entire video conferencing platform. You have Microsoft Teams, which a lot of people have good luck with. And in academic environments, there's other ones like Blue Jeans and Big Blue Button and all sorts. So there are different options out there. Obviously, Zoom has sort of taken over because it's fairly user-friendly. And it's pretty clean in terms of interface and performance. So there's a software piece, but there's also the internet access. And I mentioned this because this is also, when they shut down the library and we closed our doors of a lot of our agencies, suddenly there was no public computer access. And that's been very hard for a lot of people. Vulnerable people who don't have that access. Even if they have a device, the library does have Wi-Fi available around the building, actually. But that's an important piece too. And especially when we get out into rural environments and small population centers, internet access is a really touchy thing. There are people actually advocating for internet access as a fundamental right. It is in many ways, core infrastructure. So we may see different government approaches to that in the future. The other thing is training. And we've all been on Zoom calls where, there's one guy who takes 10 minutes to figure out how his mic works. We can try and preempt some of these issues. And maybe it doesn't happen as much anymore, but we can try and preempt some of these issues with some decent training. We kind of threw Zoom at people and some other things and said, let's do this, but we need to be trained. There are some, different comfort levels with different technologies here. I know, I remember trying to teach my father how to use iTunes. And I realized that I take it for granted that I can look at a new technology and figure out what's the fundamental 10% I need to use this on a basic level. I can figure that out fairly quickly. And my father wanted to go through every tab and every menu and ask, what does that button do? That's not the approach we take. People who are very comfortable with technology intuitively will learn that fundamental 10%, but lots of other people need far more help in doing that. Of course, a lot of us have made immediate program and service adaptations. And again, I'm just putting in there focusing on mission. It's very important to be focused on mission. And actually, some organizations are experiencing a stronger mission focus at this time, stronger team unity. So there's some silver linings in all of this. And then, of course, ensure health and safety protocols. And that's an increasingly common question is, how do we do this risk management piece? How do we do health and safety if we're going to reopen either our business or our organization to the public or members? So that's part of the respond piece. And what I'll do is I will send this PowerPoint. You will all receive this. So I've loaded up a bunch of information and resources here. I'm not going to go through it all now, but it'll be there for you. I will just identify a couple of things. The first item in technology is TechSoup. For nonprofits who aren't aware, TechSoup negotiates good rates for nonprofits on all sorts of technology software. So it's worth getting a membership in TechSoup if you're thinking of getting a subscription to Zoom or other such platforms. And there's Zoom tutorials there. On the Zoom site, there's lots of tutorials for how to use the different functions. It's important that we train people correctly if we want them to participate in the virtual workplace. So you can look through those more afterwards. I do want to point out one kind of funny story. You know, a lot of people are talking about how we're zoomed out and some of the funny stories about engaging over video conferencing. And there's one person, Lizette Ocampo, she's political director for People for the American Way, which might sound like an organization you don't want to have much to do with, but actually they battle right-wing extremism and they support civic engagement in the US. It's actually a pretty cool organization. But here's an example of video conferencing gone wrong. This is the boss in this particular work team. She made herself in Microsoft Teams a potato, and she didn't know how to undo it. So she spent the entire hour-long meeting as a potato. You've probably seen this. It was quite the disaster. All right, so we did reaffirm, we did respond. Let's do review. So I just want to highlight a few important things here. Of course, when we look at our financial situation, there's some important things to review. And you need, if you don't have money coming in, you may want to be calculating your burn rate. Basically, how long will our cash last us based on a few different scenarios. And I mentioned this, and I've got a good resource for this. You know, we've been surprised that actually in the provincial nonprofit survey conducted by Vantage Point and Vancouver Foundation, they found that a significant number of organizations don't actually know how long they've got, which sounds pretty dangerous. So it's important to do that to figure out your cash flow projection. Of course, you're going to be reviewing your funder and contractual obligations. There are organizations that would like to redirect some of their monies, some of their reserve funding or restricted funding. You can't do that, of course, without permission, but make sure you've got a good handle on what your obligations are with the money that you have in the bank. And most of you have probably done that by this point. And review anticipated revenue. I mentioned events, you know, and it's coming through in the early results of our second survey. Again, that one of the major things that people are dealing with is how to replace event-based fundraising, or how to replicate events in other ways, how to meet the objectives that they normally achieve with events, whether that's publicity or fundraising. And of course, investigate subsidies and relief measures. And there's lots of different resources. I'm going to give you a link to one website that's updated regularly with all the subsidies and relief measures. That's the one that I go to. You know, we all probably get a lot of emails every day with new updates on different sort of things that are happening. It's hard to keep up in many ways. And in some cases too, I got an update the other day from my heating and cooling company about mental health during COVID. It was fascinating. In terms of governance, one of the major issues that people are talking about is risk management. So there's obviously a lot of policy that needs to either be created or updated around health and safety and around other types of risks as well, whether that's use of funds, fund development, other such things. But also in terms of governance, and probably a lot of you have done this as well, is reviewing your bylaws and adapting your AGM plans. Yeah, you know, the government has allowed absolutely everybody to do a virtual AGM. There was a ministerial order that said basically you can do it. I've got a link to a resource that's basically a guide to doing a virtual AGM. Your AGM may look different depending on how many people normally come to your AGM. For large member-driven organizations, it's quite a production. So it's important to figure out how to do that well. But your bylaws also will have some language around the AGM. Though there are allowances for virtual AGMs at this time. The governance piece too is, you know, as I think I mentioned, you know, different boards have responded differently. Some have gone completely silent, and others, in some cases, have actually some board members, some volunteer directors have more time. In some cases, they're dealing with a business that's had to shut down and can't do online orders or something, and they have more time, and so they're supporting their staff even more at this time. Other things are review event plans, obviously, and I've got a link to a good resource for planning, canceling all types of events, virtual or otherwise. So that'll be in the resources section. And like I said, I'll have time at the end for questions, discussion about any of these things, and you can always follow up afterwards on any of these points. So this is what I'm calling the review stage, is basically looking at everything they're doing. And there's that final piece too, review the value proposition to members. Member-driven organizations may see significantly decreased revenues if they can't provide value, as people are looking for, businesses and individuals are looking for ways to cut costs. They will be reevaluating your value proposition, so you need to as well. And there again, there's some resources for you which you can look at after. And risk management, you know, as I said, that's emerging as a really important and common topic. So I'm doing a lot more digging, and hopefully on the Changelink website, I'll have lots of good resources for risk management there. But there at the bottom, you see that great resource on events, blog Bizabo, lots of great resources on that site. So what I've said here after reaffirm, respond, and review is mobilize. And this is sort of the middle stage here, which we're sort of in. So one of the important things here is to ensure effective virtual management and solidify new working norms. Managing virtual teams is not easy. We've all discovered that. And it's not the same as managing in-person teams in office environments. In fact, I mean, there's research to show that it actually takes more time. We spend between 1 and 3 hours more doing personal check-ins and stuff like that. So that creates capacity issues. If you're managing a team virtually, it does simply make more time. That's part of the reason a lot of us are feeling zoomed out. But I've got a couple of good articles there on managing virtual teams. And of course, the other thing we see in virtual management is actually an increased emphasis on mental health and wellness. That's one of the things that I hope don't go away, that actually we're doing a lot more wellness checks with each other. One of the important things to point out here too is that performance metrics must change. I have seen organizations where they're concerned about performance dips in staff. We have to be careful not to be too cruel, and to understand that actually we're all learning these brand new ways of working, and that the performance metrics that we've relied on traditionally for staff, but also for leaders and EDs and CEOs, are not necessarily the same, and we need to revise those. We are making ongoing program and service adaptations. The big questions right now are, what does reopening look like? And how do we do sort of half program and service virtual, half in person, things like that. Also ensure the board is engaged. And my advice here is over communicate. You can't send them too much information. The alternative to a board having too much information is a board that doesn't have enough information and is actually suddenly worried, and then they cross that magic line between board and operations, which frustrates every organizational leader, violating the old noses in, hands out principle. In some cases, it's appropriate for a board to get a little bit more operational, a little bit more hands-on at this time. It depends on the capacity within the organization. So some of those lines between governance and operations are fuzzy at times like this, and they need to be renegotiated. But I think we need open, honest conversations about how that is working. Create a communication plan. And this is related to the next point, which is engage all your stakeholders. So there's, at a certain point, you know, in the early days of the crisis, we were all very internal focused. We're focused on our team, our staffing, our technology, our cash flow. But at a certain point, and the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned, we need to bring our heads up and we need to start looking at the outside world. We need to engage with all of our stakeholders. And that means funders, it means the general public, the people we serve, of course, but community partners. You know, one of the things we found in our first survey was that the greatest need identified by nonprofits in Kamloops was a need for help understanding what their colleagues, partners, and community allies are doing. So what we saw was organizations that feel very isolated. They may actually have a greater connection with an umbrella organization or association than they do with their local partners. So we've been doing community roundtables to try and connect people. And then opportunities like this, North Shore Business Improvement Association doing an amazing job. That's what we're doing here too, is we're connecting with our community partners and allies. I think Elise will talk more about communication plan in her workshop, so please don't miss that. But also it's a time for seeking out new partnerships and collaborations. People are very open right now in many ways to talking and to forging new relationships. So I think it's important to go out and form some of those. I worry about isolated organizations at this time that run into trouble. You know, I've asked actually a lot of people in nonprofit, even at the provincial level, how do we make an environment or a system where struggling organizations will reach out for help rather than floundering in silence and shame? And we don't have good answers for that. But I think that your chances of thriving in the future will increase if you go out there and seek new partnerships and collaborators. So that's mobilize. I'll show you just a couple of things here. There's two good articles on virtual management from the Harvard Business Review. I suggest reading those. They're very informative. And then also on the stakeholders front, I'll just show you this example here. This is an exercise you can do in your organization. You can basically list all the stakeholder groups, either individual or stakeholder categories. And then you can throw them up on a matrix like this, which has on the vertical axis there you see power. So that's influence. How much power do they have to affect what you do? And then the horizontal axis there you see interest. So on the far right hand side, high interest means they're very interested. And so you can plot all your stakeholders on this map. And then your approach to your stakeholders will differ in how you communicate with them depending on where they are in this map. And one of the things too that's interesting to ask is choose a number like 2, 3, or 4 and say, if we had to focus on 3 stakeholder groups and bring them closer, increase their power and their interest in us, which would those be? And that can help inform some communication planning too. And by the way, this is a little screenshot from software I use called Miro. On a very basic level, it's free online. It's an online whiteboarding platform. As a facilitator, it's very difficult not to be in a room of people with my sticky notes. So I have found a virtual way to do this, and we'll do this in planning sessions. So I've still got my sticky notes. Miro, I'll send a link to that as well. Step 5, so we've done reaffirm, we've done respond, we've done review, and we've done mobilize, and now we've got plan. And really, it's not too soon to start thinking about what does the next year look like. And some organizations are doing that. Some organizations are building one-year plans. There's one on this call that we're doing a one-year plan together. It's very important to look at the future, despite uncertainty. We have to plan with the uncertainty in mind. So this could mean refreshing or creating a new strategic framework. You know, when this first happened, most of my clients, if not all of them, pressed pause on our strategic planning processes. I'd say 80% of those projects are now back online. We're doing them virtually. Boards are willing to engage with strategic planning, and I think it's a good time to do it. I think it's a good time for these generative conversations about identity, purpose, and values. This will really help ground our work, keep us mission focused, and involve the board, because boards are also looking for ways to be engaged. And we know the kinds of things that actually engage boards and make them feel satisfied with their volunteer contribution. And it's these kinds of generative conversations that do that. Also in terms of planning, scenario planning, and there are different tools you can use, different matrices you can use for scenario planning, but basically there's a lot of uncertainty. So we need to make a few different mini plans. If these two things happen, this is what it looks like. If this happens and this doesn't happen, this is what it looks like. And to be running through these different scenarios so that you're prepared for different eventualities. So some of the strategic planning or planning in general looks a little different. Because this is a good thing to do in any case, but especially now we need to try and accommodate different possible futures. Another important thing too is consider long-term implications of short-term solutions. And I think this is really important to emphasize, is that we're taking certain steps organizationally, we're making certain operational changes right now that are going to have long-term implications. Whether that's on the people you serve, your clients, your members, or whether that's on staff, whether that's on organizational reputation, we need to think about what the long-term implications are. Also, I've included here, or the consequences of inaction. If we don't do something, what are the long-term implications? And that's a very important thing to do too, because it is very easy to sort of get spooked or get cold feet or get confused at this time and to do nothing. Fund development planning, and I've got a little matrix that can help with some of this. Your revenue streams, your traditional revenue streams may not be the same as what they were over the past few years. So over the next year, over the next 2 years, over the next 3 years, you may have to replace some funds that you get, especially through, for example, events or earned revenue, and you need to be very intentional about how you do that. You know, there is short-term solutions, so you know it's a very good idea to go out, talk with your donors, even if you're not asking them for money, if you have donors, to keep them updated on what you're doing. And you might convert people into donors that haven't been donors before. There's a lot of people out there who are actually looking to help. And so some organizations have actually seen an increase in donations at this time. That's not strange to hear about. Just talked with one that said their April 2020 was better than their April 2019 in terms of donations and fundraising. So it's important to go out there and talk to your donors. But also a big question that we're facing right now, and I don't have a good answer for this, but I'm interested in engaging in creative conversations about this, is how do we monetize virtual activities? If you normally run a festival like the Kamloops Society for the Written Arts, or if you run an annual conference that generates significant revenue but also provides value to your members, you're suddenly trying to figure out how to do it virtually. But it's not just about how do we do this virtually, it's about how do we monetize this? And that's an important question that we need to consider. And we'll hopefully discover some really good solutions for that. But also what I'm including here is look for transformational opportunities. You know, there's been an article going around the arts community by a fellow who's identified basically the world is dividing into two sort of camps. There's the restorationists and the opportunists. Right? So the group of people who think are hopeful that someday we will go back to the way it was before, and then the people who are thinking actually the future is different. We need to look at new ways of doing things, and that takes a lot of confidence, but it's important to keep an eye out for some of those transformational opportunities. Some organizations are being forced to have conversations that they maybe should have had for the past 5 years, and now they have to, actually. So there's some creative destruction happening here. That's plan. I'll just quickly go over these so you know what they are, but they'll be in the PowerPoint that you get. This is from Vantage Point. So they've presented this little framework. They've got basically things divided into mobilize, stabilize, strategize, and then these 6 categories here where you can plan some of your activities. That's a useful one. This is another one that is pretty useful for having conversations about what are you going to let go? What don't you know about? What new things are you going to do? So you can certainly do an exercise with your leadership team around this. There's a little traditional scenario planning matrix where you've gone through and you've identified key influencing factors and then critical uncertainties, and then you put 2 uncertainties on this matrix here and you plan different scenarios. So if uncertainty 1 happens and uncertainty 2 doesn't, it looks like this. If they both happen, it looks like this. If neither of them, and so on. But those tools are there for you to use at your leisure. And then in terms of fund development planning, this is just a little tool that I've developed based on a couple other tools. Basically looking at your current revenue streams, how much you get from them, the percent of total. Also interesting to look at the percent of time that these different revenue streams take. That can be very hard to gauge. A lot of organizations don't have a really clear sense of the volunteer hours that go into things, but it's good to try and get a sense of that. Because we do have good research on which types of fundraising actually have the biggest bang for the buck, and how much it costs in time and money to actually raise $1 for different things. And then, so that's what you see in the first 3 columns is your current, and then you see your target. So you can have good, honest conversations in your organization about where the money has come from in the past, and maybe where you need to replace some of those revenue streams or emphasize different ones. And at the bottom there, you just see a space for notes on investments in capacity. Obviously, if you're changing how you raise money, you need the capacity to do that. Communications investments, relationship investments, and board involvement. All right. And there's just a few different tools here that you can see. Scenario planning, complete guide to online fundraising. That's from an organization called Kila, which does software to help nonprofits fundraise, but they've got a ton of great resources online. So you can check all those out afterwards. So my question, we got to do a 6th step, which is for John, but I think it's very important, again, to do this future retrospective. Imagine it is May 2021. What questions are funders or members asking us? This is really important because I think that the organizations that are going to thrive in the future will have good answers to funders and members' questions 1 year from now. And one of the things that I think, or a couple of the things that I think funders are going to be asking are, how did COVID impact your impact? That is, how did it reduce your impact, or how did it impact the people you serve? And also, what creative adaptations did you make? And I think that we need good answers for those because the funding environment is going to be a little bit tighter. So just going to this Forge Ahead thing here, and then we'll do some questions and discussion. And this is sort of just re-emphasizing some of the things that I've already gone through, is keep your eye on your mission. I think these are going to be, if we have good stories about these, we will be in a good place for funders and members. Take care of yourself and your people. Participate in broader conversations. And I've got links to a few organizations if you want to get involved in broader conversations about nonprofit. Stay adaptive and learn to live with uncertainty. Find creative solutions. Tell the story and ask for help. I think I mentioned I'm worried about organizations not reaching out for help when they need it. So please do ask for help. And at ChangeLink, we're hopefully going to provide a lot of good connections and resources for you. But let us know how you're doing. So there's some opportunities for learning and getting connected. Vantage Point, wonderful organization. They're offering free membership at this time. So that's very useful. They have tons of resources. Kila is running an adaptation webinar series. That's fantastic. I know some people are webinared out as well. But Imagine Canada is doing some great work. Social Impact Architects and Charity Village have great resources, as does Center for Social Innovation. And then Scale Collaborative is the organization in Victoria that assists organizations in diversifying their revenue streams. So apologies for speed in this. I decided to err on the side of comprehensiveness rather than doing deep dive into one topic. But my hope is that you have tons of great resources after this. So there, Jeremy, should we open it up?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cindy did type in a question. She said, when looking at opportunities for amalgamation, what kinds of questions do we want to be asking about potential organizations to work with?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think the big thing is to find a fit on vision, mission, and values. I think it all starts there. Just as what I've started with is reaffirming those things, I think you need some kind of fit there. If there's not a good mission fit and a good values fit, there's probably going to be a more conflict in trying to make that happen than there is synergy. So I think there's a feeling out process involved in that, and finding out but also the other thing is complementary resources and strengths. So you may find an organization, for example, that does really good at stakeholder engagement, marketing, and advertising, and you're good on technology and resources, and that might be a good fit too. So I think basically vision, mission, values fit, but also complementary strengths.
Okay, so earlier you were talking, and I'll mute here in about 2 seconds, but earlier you were talking about the burn rate and covering costs. And I know for business, it's usually a 3 to 6 months, depending upon how your business is structured, that you hold back in savings to cover sort of unforeseens like now. What is the normative for most nonprofits? What does their typical capitalization look like?
I wish there was a norm. There's a lot of debate over how much you're allowed to have, actually, and there's actually not a clear answer on that. I mean, different organizations will have different policies on reserve funds. I'm dealing with some organizations, that have a year in the bank. They've got a year of operations in the bank, and so right now they're actually going about a lot of this crisis management very confidently because they don't have that financial piece hanging over their heads. But there are organizations that are looking at less than 3 months, and they're trying to right now find really creative ways to cut costs. And my hope is that they can find some really creative solutions so that they don't actually burn out. So there's no set answer there. I don't think most have more than 6 months, but that's not an expert or well-researched answer.
Fair enough. All right, so the phone lines are open. So if you'd like to, I guess we'll just sort of have a little chaotic fun here and see who gets the first question in. Anybody?
Well, I might as well. One, I'd really quickly loved a link to that restorationist versus transformationalist thing. I think that's a really key thing, and that transformation approach is one that I've certainly been looking at with the various hats that I'm wearing. My question is, and a few people that I've worked with, when they're struggling right now, often they were struggling before this, and I really recommended that amalgamation, and especially that co-location. A few people have been saying, hey, we need to find a cheaper place. I'm like, well, who has services similar to yours and might want to share a space? Because this is something you probably would have liked to have looked at 6 months ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it's harder to look at, but when you're doing well, but during a crisis is a really good time, and I think you'll come out of it a lot stronger. So I'd be interested to see a mechanism for kind of pairing up these organizations that might really have symbiotic relationships in the same location.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Nicholas. And I think that those things don't end up on the table until a little too late. Sometimes that's what I see, and especially a good time to do this because a lot of offices are reducing their footprint. Right, they plan on actually having a lot more people working virtually going forward. So on a business level too, actually, we're looking at offices that don't have as many people. And I've asked at the provincial level about mechanisms for this, and there is an organization in Vancouver actually that does, I'll dig up the name, that basically helps organizations find matching space because it's hard to do by yourself. But I think that that's only useful in Vancouver, unfortunately. But my hope is that in ChangeLink, this is one of the haves needs kind of things that we'll have on our ChangeLink website. And if an organization has extra space and is maybe maybe thinking, well, we can bring an organizational partner in here, that we can put that out there and get people thinking about that early. So my answer to you, Nicholas, is hopefully through ChangeLink. It's hard to do if it's not facilitated, if we don't have some place to find that information about people looking for or offering that.
And I think this is the case for all resources. One that's been mentioned to me by businesses, but I think this certainly affects a lot of nonprofits, are little things like printer leases. You know, there's a spot where if you have a couple people co-locate or share resources, that you could be knocking, you know, $100, sometimes $200 off of monthly operational costs. Right. And we're not utilizing these resources to their full extent. We're paying a lot of money to have things sit there. So I think anytime we are reproducing any type of resource, we should be looking at amalgamating those right now. It's a good time to do it.
Yeah, sharing all sorts of office costs is useful. And the challenge with all this too that I'm experiencing is that, you know, we're talking about the timing of leases. You know, one organization is still sitting on 2 years left on their 5-year term. How do they get out of that and share space, right? So there's some challenges there. And landlords obviously right now are dealing with their own financial pressures. So releasing someone from a lease, that's tough too, right? So challenges.